I attended the wedding of the man who destroyed my life. What I didn't know was that fate had in store for me not just revenge, but the most devastating justice. With the help of a man who endured an even greater tragedy, caused by the same enemy, we transformed that humiliating celebration into the fall of an empire built on pain and the theft of innocent lives. But before we tell this incredible story, please click the subscribe button. For you, it may be just a click, but for us, it's the fuel we need to continue finding and sharing these incredible stories with you. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning, cream-colored cardstock that felt like a reopened wound against my fingertips. A David Richardson and Sophia Chen request the honor of your presence. I stared at those elegant gold letters until they blurred, my coffee growing cold as memories crashed over me like a tsunami I thought I'd learned to outrun. 5 years had passed since our divorce. 5 years since he'd systematically destroyed not just our marriage but my entire professional reputation, painting me as a vindictive ex-wife when I'd tried to expose his unethical business practices. The legal community had closed ranks around him, believing his carefully crafted narrative that portrayed me as bitter and delusional. Now here he was, inviting me to witness his triumph, the ultimate insult wrapped in wedding bells and false civility. I should have thrown it away, should have protected the fragile peace I'd fought so hard to build. But something deeper than pride stirred in my chest, a need to prove that Emma Richardson couldn't be erased from history, no matter how hard he'd tried. The Saint. Regis Hotel in downtown Boston buzzed with pre-wedding energy as I stepped into the marble lobby, my emerald dress catching the afternoon light like armor forged from determination and designer silk. I'd chosen every detail carefully, the color that had always been David's favorite, now reclaimed as my own, the cut that spoke of success without desperation, the confidence that had taken 5 years to rebuild from the ashes of public humiliation. 300 guests milled around me, faces I recognized from our old life together, people who'd chosen sides when our marriage imploded in spectacular fashion across Boston's legal and social pages. Their whispers followed me like ghosts as I made my way through the crowd, each sideways glance a reminder of the woman they thought I'd become. Bitter, broken, relegated to footnote status in David's success story. But I held my head high, channeling every ounce of the courtroom presence that had slowly, painstakingly rebuilt my career from nothing. This wasn't just about attending a wedding. This was about rewriting the narrative they'd all accepted as truth. The ceremony space was a vision of white roses and crystal chandeliers, David's new money on full display in every carefully curated detail. I found a seat in the back, grateful for the anonymity it provided while I observed the spectacle unfolding before me like a perfectly choreographed performance. Sophia looked radiant in her designer gown, completely unaware of the man she was marrying, completely ignorant of the lives he'd destroyed to build the empire that afforded this lavish celebration. The guest list read like a who's who of Boston's elite, the same people who'd turned their backs on me when David's character assassination campaign painted me as an unstable woman, making false accusations against her successful ex-husband. I watched them smile and congratulate each other, these fair-weather friends who'd believed his lies without question, who'd watched my professional destruction with the detached interest of spectators at a gladiator match. My fingers gripped my clutch tighter as the familiar burn of injustice flared in my chest. 5 years of suppressed anger threatening to surface despite my carefully maintained composure. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" The voice was smooth, confident, with just a hint of an accent that spoke of old money and East Coast breeding. I looked up to find a man in his early 40s, impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that whispered quality rather than shouting wealth like David's flashy displays. His dark hair was silver at the temples, his green eyes holding a depth that seemed to see straight through the masks we all wore in places like this. Something about him felt familiar, though I was certain we'd never met. I would have remembered those eyes, that presence that commanded attention without demanding it. He gestured to the empty chair beside me with a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and I noticed the absence of a wedding ring, the expensive watch that spoke of success earned rather than stolen. "I'm Marcus Sterling," he said, extending his hand with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to making introductions in rooms full of powerful people. The name meant nothing to me, but the way he said it suggested it should, carried weight that hinted at influence and connections I couldn't yet place. "Emma Richardson," I replied, accepting his handshake and noting the firm grip, the calluses that suggested he wasn't just another trust fund baby playing at business. He settled beside me with the grace of someone comfortable in any room, his presence somehow making the awkward situation feel less isolating, less like a solo performance of dignity under fire. "I have to ask," he said quietly, leaning closer so only I could hear above the pre-ceremony chatter, "You don't look like you want to be here any more than I do." There was something conspiratorial in his tone, an invitation to share the burden of whatever had brought us both to this elaborate theater of happiness and new beginnings. I studied his profile as he watched David appear at the altar, noting the slight tension in his jaw, the way his fingers drummed silently against his knee in a rhythm that spoke of barely contained energy. He was here for a reason beyond celebrating love. That much was clear. The question was whether that reason aligned with mine. "A family obligation," I ventured, testing the waters of this unexpected alliance while wondering what could possibly connect this polished stranger to David's world. "Something like that," Marcus replied, his smile turning sardonic as David preened in his custom tuxedo, every inch the successful businessman who'd convinced the world he was a victim of his ex-wife's vindictive lies. "Us, though I suspect my reasons for being here are far more personal than familial duty." The way he said it made something cold settle in my stomach, a recognition that this man knew more than he was letting on, had perhaps come here with his own agenda that might intersect with mine in ways I couldn't yet imagine. "And you?" he asked, though something in his expression suggested he already knew the answer, had perhaps known exactly who I was before approaching my isolated corner of the reception space. I felt a chill run down my spine, not unpleasant, but certainly unexpected, as if fate had just dealt me a card I hadn't known I was playing for. "Oh, let's just say I have a vested interest in seeing how this particular fairy tale ends," I murmured, surprised by my own honesty with this stranger who somehow made me feel less alone in a room full of people who'd written me off years ago. As the wedding march began, and all eyes turned to the bride's entrance, Marcus leaned over once more, his voice barely audible above the swelling music. "I have a proposition for you, Emma Richardson," he said, my name rolling off his tongue like a prayer he'd been rehearsing for years. "What if I told you that pretending to be my date tonight could give us both exactly what we came here for?" The music reached its crescendo as Sophia began her walk down the aisle, but I found myself transfixed by this stranger's words, by the promise of something I couldn't yet name but desperately wanted to believe in. His green eyes held mine with an intensity that made the wedding feel like mere background noise to whatever game he was proposing we play, whatever justice he was offering that I'd been denied for far too long. I should have been cautious, should have politely declined and maintained the safe distance I'd cultivated from anything that might complicate my carefully rebuilt life. But something about Marcus Sterling, something about this moment suspended between past pain and future possibility, made me want to throw caution to the wind and finally fight back. "Your proposition," I whispered back, my voice barely audible as Sophia glided past us in her cascade of ivory silk and borrowed dreams, completely unaware that her perfect day was about to become the stage for a reckoning 5 years in the making. Marcus's eyes never left mine, even as the assembled guests rose to their feet in traditional reverence for the bride, and I felt something electric pass between us, not just attraction, but recognition, as if we were two soldiers who'd finally found each other on the same battlefield. "I'll play my girlfriend for the evening," he said simply, his words carrying weight that suggested this was about far more than social theater or saving face among Boston's elite. "Always help me navigate the politics of this crowd, and I'll give you something you've been searching for since the day David Richardson destroyed your life." His hand found mine as we stood with the other guests, fingers intertwining with a familiarity that should have felt wrong, but somehow felt like coming home after a long, cold exile. The ceremony began with all the pomp and circumstance money could buy. But I found myself studying Marcus's profile instead of watching David's performance of devoted groom. There was something in the set of his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened when David spoke his vows, that spoke of personal investment beyond mere professional interest. "What makes you think David destroyed my life?" I asked quietly, though we both knew the answer was written in every newspaper article, every whispered conversation, every client who'd dropped me overnight when the scandal broke. Marcus turned to look at me then, really look at me. His green eyes seeing past the carefully constructed facade I wore like armor against a world that had judged me and found me wanting. Because, he said softly, his voice carrying a pain that matched my own. "I know what it feels like to watch someone you trusted steal everything that mattered, then convince the world you were the villain in your own destruction." The words hit deeper than I expected, exposing nerves I'd thought were long healed and carefully protected behind walls of professional success and emotional distance. He wasn't just offering me an alliance. He was offering me understanding from someone who'd walked through the same fire and emerged scarred but unbroken. "David hurt you too," I said. And it wasn't a question because the truth was written in every line of tension around his eyes, every carefully controlled breath as we watched my ex-husband promise to love and honor another woman. Marcus nodded slowly, his thumb tracing across my knuckles in what appeared to be an affectionate gesture, but felt like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in memories of injustice and betrayal. "3 years ago," he said, his voice barely audible above the officiant's words about love and commitment. "David Richardson's financial schemes killed my mother." The revelation hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath as the full weight of his words settled between us. "Your mother," I whispered, my heart breaking for this stranger who'd just shared his deepest wound with someone he'd known for less than an hour. Marcus's eyes never left the altar where David stood proclaiming his devotion, but I could see the grief and rage warring beneath his composed exterior. "Sir Eleanor Sterling," he said, and the name meant nothing to me, but the way he spoke it, like a prayer and a battle cry combined, told me everything I needed to know about the depth of his loss. She was 73, a retired teacher who'd saved every penny for 40 years to ensure a comfortable retirement. David's Harbor View investment scheme took her life savings, $200,000 that represented her entire future. His voice remained steady, but I felt the tremor in his hand where it held mine, the barely contained fury of a son who'd watched his mother's dreams crumble. "She died 6 months later," Marcus continued, his words falling like stones into the silence between us while David's voice carried across the space, promising fidelity and honesty to his new bride. The stress of losing everything, of realizing she'd have to go back to work at 73 just to survive, her heart couldn't take it. The doctors said it was a massive coronary, but I know the truth. David Richardson killed her as surely as if he'd put a gun to her chest. I felt tears burning behind my eyes, not just for his loss, but for the recognition of shared pain, shared injustice that had brought us together in this moment of David's greatest triumph. "I'm so sorry," I whispered, the words inadequate but heartfelt, carrying all the empathy of someone who understood what it meant to have David Richardson tear your world apart and walk away unscathed. "Ouch!" When I started investigating David's business practices, trying to build a case for my mother's stolen money, I discovered something interesting, Marcus said, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing state secrets. "Your name kept appearing in my research, not as a bitter ex-wife making false accusations, but as the one person who'd tried to expose him years before he killed my mother." The pieces began clicking into place with devastating clarity. This wasn't a chance meeting, wasn't coincidence that had brought Marcus Sterling to my side tonight. "You knew who I was before you sat down," I said, understanding flooding through me like ice water as I realized the depth of planning behind this moment. Marcus nodded, his green eyes finally meeting mine with an intensity that made the rest of the world fade away. "I've been watching you for 3 years, Emma. Watching you rebuild your career, watching you help other victims of financial fraud, watching you become exactly the kind of lawyer I needed to finally bring David Richardson to justice." The officiant asked for rings, and David's voice carried across the space as he promised to love Sophia with all his heart. The same words he'd once spoken to me in this very city. The same lies wrapped in different packaging for a new victim. But now his promises felt like confessions, admissions of guilt from a man who'd never learned that actions have consequences, that victims sometimes find each other and fight back. "What are you offering me?" I asked, my lawyer's mind already racing through possibilities while my heart hammered with something between hope and terror. Marcus smiled then, and it was beautiful and terrible, the expression of someone who'd spent 3 years planning the perfect revenge. "Justice," he said simply. "Real justice, not the kind that gets buried in legal technicalities and character assassination. The kind that puts David Richardson in prison where he belongs, and gives his victims back everything he stole from them." "Justice," I repeated, the word tasting like hope and danger in equal measure, as David and Sophia sealed their union with a kiss that felt like the closing of one chapter and the violent opening of another. The guests erupted in applause that seemed to echo from another world while Marcus and I remained locked in our own private universe of shared purpose and long-delayed retribution. "What kind of justice?" I pressed, my lawyer's instincts demanding details even as my wounded heart urged me to trust this stranger who'd just offered me everything I'd dreamed of for 5 years. Marcus stood with the other guests, pulling me gently to my feet as rice and rose petals began flying through the air like confetti celebrating not just a wedding, but the beginning of David Richardson's downfall. "The kind that starts tonight," he said, his hand finding the small of my back with protective familiarity, "and ends with your ex-husband facing federal charges for fraud, embezzlement, and elder abuse." The cocktail hour unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of power and pretense, each conversation a potential weapon in the war. We were about to wage against the man who'd destroyed both our lives in different ways. Marcus guided me through the crowd with the confidence of someone who belonged in rooms like this, introducing me not as David's discarded ex-wife, but as his accomplished girlfriend. A successful attorney who specialized in exactly the kind of cases that made powerful men nervous. "Emma, darling," he said to a silver-haired woman dripping in diamonds and old Boston money, "I'd like you to meet Helen Blackwood. Helen, this is Emma Richardson, the attorney I was telling you about, the one who's been making waves in financial crimes prosecution." The introduction was a masterpiece of social engineering, positioning me not as a victim, but as a threat, someone whose expertise made her dangerous to people with secrets to hide. "Richardson," Helen repeated, her eyes sharpening with recognition and calculation as she processed my name and its connection to the scandal that had once dominated Boston's social pages. "You were married to David, weren't you? Such an unfortunate situation." The words were delivered with the practiced sympathy of someone who'd never experienced real loss, who treated other people's pain like entertainment at charity galas. But instead of shrinking from the reference to my past humiliation, I found myself standing taller, drawing strength from Marcus's presence beside me and the promise of justice that hung between us like a sword waiting to fall. "It was a learning experience," I replied smoothly, my voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd survived hell and emerged stronger. "It taught me exactly how financial predators operate and how to recognize the warning signs that most people miss." The conversation continued around us, but I was hyper-aware of Marcus's hand on my back, the way he subtly guided our interactions toward the people he'd identified as key players in David's network of corruption and complicity. See the man in the navy suit talking to the brunette in the red dress?" he murmured in my ear during a lull in conversation, his breath warm against my skin in a way that made me momentarily forget we were acting. "That's Trevor Morrison, David's business partner in the Harborview development. The same project that stole my mother's life savings. I followed his gaze to where Trevor stood laughing at something David had said, completely unaware that his world was about to implode. "What about him?" I asked, though something in Marcus's tone suggested I wasn't going to like the answer. "Trevor Morrison has been keeping detailed records of every transaction, every offshore account, every illegal transfer that's funded David's empire," Marcus explained, his voice taking on the satisfaction of someone whose long-laid plans were finally coming to fruition. "Insurance policies, he calls them? Protection against exactly the kind of exposure that's coming his way very soon." The implications hit me like a physical blow as I realized the scope of what Marcus had orchestrated. This wasn't just about revenge or even justice. This was about dismantling an entire network of corruption that had been operating in plain sight for years. "Art! How do you know about Morrison's records?" I asked, my mind racing through the legal possibilities while my heart pounded with anticipation of finally seeing David face consequences for his actions. "Because," Marcus said, his smile sharp as a blade as he watched Trevor Morrison's increasingly nervous glances toward the exits. "Trevor Morrison received a very interesting phone call this afternoon. A call from federal investigators who've been building a case against David Richardson for the past 18 months. Investigators who suddenly found themselves in possession of evidence that could put Trevor away for 20 years unless he cooperates fully with their investigation." The timeline snapped into focus with terrifying clarity. This entire evening had been orchestrated not just to expose David, but to give me front-row seats to his destruction while positioning me as the architect of justice rather than a passive victim of his crimes. "You planned all of this," I said, though it wasn't really a question. The invitation I'd received, the seating arrangements, even this conversation. Every detail had been carefully calculated to bring us to this moment. "Every detail," Marcus confirmed, his thumb tracing across my knuckles in a gesture that was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss as mere performance. But Emma, you need to understand something important. This isn't just about destroying David Richardson. This is about giving you back everything he took from you, and more." He turned to face me fully, his green eyes intense with purpose and something deeper that made my breath catch in my throat. "The federal investigation that's about to destroy David's empire? It's being led by prosecutor Sarah Chen, Sophia's older sister, who's been working this case for 2 years without knowing her baby sister was about to marry the target of her investigation." The revelation was like a punch to the gut, another layer of Marcus's elaborate revenge that would destroy not just David, but the innocent woman who just promised to love him forever. The dinner reception unfolded like a Greek tragedy in 3 acts, each course bringing us closer to the moment when David Richardson's carefully constructed world would come crashing down around him. Marcus and I had been seated at table 7, close enough to observe the key players but far enough from David's inner circle to conduct our private war council without attracting unwanted attention. I found myself studying the guests with new eyes, seeing not just the faces from our old life, but potential witnesses to the crimes that were about to be exposed. People whose comfortable ignorance was about to be shattered by the truth Marcus had spent 3 years uncovering. Sarah Chen doesn't know yet," Marcus said quietly, cutting into his salmon with the precision of a surgeon. "But she's about to receive evidence that will force her to choose between her sister's happiness and her oath as a federal prosecutor." The weight of what we were about to unleash settled over me like a shroud as I watched Sophia laugh at something David whispered in her ear, completely unaware that her new husband was about to destroy her family in ways she couldn't imagine. "This will destroy her too," I said, my conscience warring with my desire for justice as I thought about the innocent woman who'd just pledged her life to a monster. Marcus's hand found mine under the table, his fingers intertwining with a familiarity that had developed over the course of one extraordinary evening. "David Richardson destroyed my mother," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of 3 years of grief and planning. "He destroyed your career, your reputation, your faith in justice. How many more people has he hurt? How many more will he hurt if we don't stop him tonight?" The questions hung between us like a bridge across an impossible chasm, connecting my past pain to this moment of potential redemption in ways that made my chest tight with emotion. I thought of all the elderly victims like Marcus's mother, people who'd trusted David with their life savings only to watch their dreams evaporate in his schemes. I thought of the other women who might follow in Sophia's footsteps, drawn to his charm and wealth without knowing the cost of loving a man who viewed people as assets to be exploited. What happens when the evidence surfaces? I asked, my lawyer's mind already racing through the legal implications, while my heart prepared for the emotional fallout that was about to engulf everyone in this room. Sarah Chen will have no choice but to act, Marcus explained, his voice taking on the clinical tone of someone who'd wargamed every possible scenario. The evidence is too solid, too damning to ignore. Wire transfers, recorded conversations, documented proof of David's involvement in defrauding pension funds across 3 states. She'll have to arrest him, probably within the next 72 hours. The timeline was breathtaking in its precision, a countdown to justice that had been years in the making. And Trevor Morrison? I pressed, watching as the man in question excused himself from his table with the nervous energy of someone whose world was about to implode. Marcus's smile was sharp as winter wind, all pretense of the charming dinner companion falling away to reveal the predator beneath. Trevor Morrison received a visit from federal agents this afternoon, Marcus revealed, his satisfaction evident in every word. They presented him with evidence of his involvement in the Harbor View fraud, along with a choice: cooperate fully with their investigation and testify against David Richardson, or face federal charges that could put him away for the rest of his life. The beautiful symmetry of it took my breath away. David's own business partner, the man he'd trusted with his darkest secrets, would be the instrument of his destruction. He's already signed a cooperation agreement, Marcus continued, his thumb brushing across my knuckles in a gesture that sent electricity up my arm. By tomorrow morning, David Richardson will be the target of a federal investigation with enough evidence to convict him 10 times over. As if summoned by our conversation, David rose from the head table with his champagne glass raised high, every inch the successful businessman celebrating his greatest acquisition yet. "Dear my friends," he began, his voice carrying across the dining room with the practiced confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. "Tonight isn't just about celebrating my marriage to the incredible Sophia, but about celebrating how far we've all come together." His gesture encompassed the room full of business associates and social climbers, people who'd helped build his empire on foundations of betrayal and stolen dreams. But as he spoke about success and partnership, I noticed the subtle signs of panic beginning to show. The slight tremor in his hand, the way his eyes kept darting toward the exits, the forced quality of his smile that suggested he already knew his time was running out. "You see," David continued, his voice growing more animated as if volume could mask the desperation creeping into his tone. "Success isn't just about individual achievement. It's about having the vision to see opportunities others miss, the courage to take calculated risks, and the wisdom to surround yourself with people who share your values." The irony was so thick I could taste it. This man who'd built his fortune on stolen pension funds lecturing about values and vision while his victims' families struggled to survive. But I also noticed something else. Marcus had his phone discreetly positioned to record David's speech, capturing every word of what would soon become evidence of his arrogance and lack of remorse. "Take our Harbor View development, for instance," David said, raising his glass toward Trevor Morrison's conspicuously empty chair. "Trevor and I saw potential where others saw problems, and now we're creating something beautiful together." The mention of Harbor View sent a visible shudder through the remaining guests at Morrison's table, people who were beginning to sense that something was very wrong with this picture-perfect evening. David's speech continued, but I could see the cracks forming in his facade, the way his confidence wavered when he realized his business partner had abandoned him at the moment of his greatest triumph. "But perhaps most importantly," David said, his eyes finding mine across the room with the kind of vindictive satisfaction that confirmed everything Marcus had told me about his character. Success means learning from our mistakes and surrounding ourselves with people who build us up rather than tear us down. The obvious reference to our failed marriage drew knowing chuckles from guests who remembered the scandal. But I found myself smiling instead of shrinking from the attack, because I knew something David didn't. His world was about to end, and I was going to have the best seat in the house to watch it happen. As David's speech reached its crescendo, praising loyalty and integrity while standing in a room full of people he'd manipulated and defrauded, my phone buzzed with an incoming text message. Marcus's hand tightened on mine as I discreetly glanced at the screen to find a message from an unknown number. Package delivered. Sarah Chen has the evidence. Arrest warrant being prepared. Justice is coming. The timestamp showed the message had been sent during David's toast to lasting partnerships, which meant that while he was celebrating his marriage and success, federal prosecutors were building the case that would destroy everything he'd stolen and lied to protect. I looked up to find Marcus watching me with an intensity that made the rest of the world fade away, his green eyes reflecting the same mixture of satisfaction and anticipation that was building in my chest like a storm about to break. "How does it feel?" Marcus asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the applause and champagne toasts that followed David's speech. "To know that justice is finally coming for the man who tried to destroy you." I considered the question seriously, expecting to feel triumphant or vindicated, but instead finding something deeper and more complex than simple revenge. "Feels like closure," I admitted, surprised by the truth of it, as I watched David accept congratulations from guests who had no idea they were witnessing the last moments of his freedom. Like I can finally stop carrying the weight of what he did to me and focus on what I'm building now. The realization was liberating in a way I hadn't expected. This wasn't about becoming the kind of person who destroyed others, but about ensuring that justice finally reached someone who'd escaped consequences for far too long. Marcus smiled then, genuine and warm, the expression of someone who'd found exactly what he'd been searching for in 3 years of careful planning and patient investigation. "There's something else," he said, as the reception began winding down around us. Guests starting to make their farewells while David and Sophia prepared for their grand exit into what they believed would be a lifetime of happiness built on stolen foundations. "Something I haven't told you about why I really wanted to meet you tonight." I turned to face him fully, noting the subtle shift in his demeanor from conspirator to something more vulnerable, more real than the roles we'd been playing all evening. The mask was finally coming off, revealing the man beneath the carefully orchestrated revenge plot. "I know about your pro bono work with elderly fraud victims," Marcus continued, his voice carrying an admiration that made my chest tight with unexpected emotion. "The cases you take on behalf of people who've lost their life savings to schemes exactly like David's. Your success rate is remarkable. You've recovered millions for people who thought they'd lost everything. People like my mother who trusted the wrong person and paid the ultimate price." The recognition in his voice was something I'd been searching for since the day David destroyed my reputation. Validation from someone who understood the true value of the work I'd been doing to rebuild not just my career, but my sense of purpose. "You're exactly the kind of lawyer I need as a permanent partner in Sterling Financial Investigations." The offer hung between us like a bridge to a future I hadn't dared imagine. A chance to turn tonight's justice into a lifetime of fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. "A partnership?" I asked, my heart racing with possibilities even as my rational mind tried to process the implications of joining forces with someone who'd just orchestrated the downfall of one of Boston's most powerful men. 50-50, Marcus confirmed, his hand covering mine with a warmth that had nothing to do with performance or pretense. "Your legal expertise, my investigative resources, and a shared commitment to taking down people like David Richardson who think they're above consequences." The vision he painted was intoxicating, a chance to be the lawyer I'd always wanted to be, fighting for justice instead of just billable hours, making a difference in the lives of people who'd been written off by a system that protected the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. As David and Sophia swept past our table in their grand exit, his empire already crumbling though he didn't know it yet. I felt a strange sense of completion settling over me like a warm blanket after years in the cold. This evening had given me something far more valuable than revenge. It had given me a partner who understood my pain, a purpose that aligned with my values, and the promise of a future where justice and love might finally converge in perfect, beautiful balance. Yes, I said, the word escaping my lips before my rational mind could intervene, sealing a pact that would change everything about my life and possibly save countless others from the kind of destruction David had inflicted on so many innocent people. Marcus's smile in response was radiant, transforming his entire face from merely handsome to absolutely captivating, the expression of someone who'd just won not just a battle, but the war itself. "Then let's go change the world, Emma Richardson," he said, rising from his chair and offering me his hand with the same gallantry he'd shown when we first met, but now with the added weight of genuine partnership and the promise of justice served not just once, but again and again for as long as there were victims who needed champions. As we walked out of the St. Regis Hotel together, leaving behind the wreckage of David Richardson's last night of freedom, I realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction. It's building something beautiful from the ashes of what was meant to break you. 3 days later, the headlines would scream about the arrest of prominent businessman David Richardson on federal fraud charges. A week after that, Trevor Morrison's testimony would seal David's fate, ensuring he'd spend the next 20 years in federal prison. But tonight, as Marcus and I stepped into the Boston evening air with our hands intertwined and our future stretching out before us like an unwritten story of justice and redemption, I knew that the real victory wasn't David's downfall. It was the fact that Emma Richardson had finally, truly, come home to herself and found a partner worthy of the fight ahead. The wedding charade was over, but our real story was just beginning.